My name is Professor Jeffrey Weinstock from the University of Miami. I also teach courses at Sage Adult Learning on Israeli music, Jewish humor, and Jewish collective memory. And I'm very excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with Laurel Fairworth, producer, and Rodney Whittenberg, musician, composer, and sound mix sound designer from the movie Codename Ayalon, which is premiering at this year's festival. Thank you all for joining us. So first, I'd like to turn to Laurel, the film's producer, and I'd like to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where you've lived, and where you live now, and how you got into filmmaking.
Well, hello, thank you. We're really excited to be here. So I was a television reporter for 20 years, and I lived all over the country. I actually lived in South Florida. I worked in West Palm, DC, LA, New York, Philadelphia, I think everywhere but Chicago I was there. And after 20 years, it felt like it was enough. And I founded a PR, marketing, and media company. And after I was in business for a couple of years, the Today Show came to me because I worked in New York for a long time and asked me if I could produce a piece for them. And I kind of became their main person, outside of New York. And so I've always been sort of a mix of PR and, news and movies, because we did shorter documentaries for news in the old days. Anyway, a couple of years ago, 6 years ago, I was in Israel with the Federation, and I came upon a story I thought was so compelling. I felt I had to make it. And when I was there, I told the people at the Bullet Factory, I am going to do a documentary on this. And they kind of, shrugged their shoulders, laughed at me a little bit. And it wasn't until I came back with the crew 2 years later to shoot the film that I found out why, which is because hundreds of people had said the same thing. And we were the first people that ever came back to do it. And I'm really glad we did, because it was from 1947 to 1949 when the Bullet Factory was in operation. And we got to interview the last 10 people who actually worked there. And fast forward now, pretty much all of them, with the exception of one or two, are gone. So I'm so glad we captured their stories on tape for everyone to enjoy. As far as where I'm living now, I live in Philadelphia, but have passport, will travel.
Thank you so much. Rodney, how did you get involved in composing, and especially in music and sound for film?
Wow, that's I'll try and tell that story quickly as opposed to the long drawn out story. But I was as a kid, I found 7 passions from the time I was about 8 or 9 years old, and music and film and television were the top 2. And I started making up songs from the time that I was about 8 or 9 years old. And one of my other passions was technology. So I started building electronic instruments when I was about 12, and started my first band when I was 12. And luckily I had a group of friends who were all into the arts. And we used to go to the movies in the little town I grew up in called Yaden, where the movie was $1. And afterwards we'd hang out and talk about the camera angles, and did the plot make sense, and was the story meaningful? And by the time I got to college, I had a larger group of friends, and we were all in the arts. And if I went through the list of them, there are all people that work in the industry to this day. Some of them are Academy Award nominees. Some of them were casting agents who discovered major stars. And they're all the people that I grew up with and went to college with and were my friends. And so it's just been a part of my life the whole time. And after spending my 20s being in a rock band and playing and touring around, I decided I didn't want to travel, but I still wanted to be in the arts. So I started Melody Vision, which is my production company. And I started writing music for theater and dance, and eventually started writing music for film and television, and then eventually started producing and also directing on my own. And that's been over 30 years now that I've been doing it.
That's really remarkable. Laurel, what was your research process for the film like?
Well, it was very intense because we had to hire a video librarian to find some, because think about it, this story was secret. beside the fact it was from the late 40s. So it isn't like today where you take your phone and you shoot it, or there's all kind of video out there. There really wasn't. I mean, the point of it was no one was supposed to know about it. So there was very little there. So we had to hire someone to find bits and pieces and this and that to try to craft the story. Mostly I wanted it in the people who were there's own words, but this is a visual medium, so you still need images. Number two, we went to the library and talked to all kinds of people, and one person led me to another person, and actually because of like Rodney, my past of being in TV news, a lot of my friends went over to programming, and they're now at Netflix or they're at HBO, or they segued sort of like I did. And so I went to meet with some people at Showtime, and they said to me, are you going to put in there about the smuggling of the guns? Because a lot of people in the United States, in the Jewish community, were very instrumental before Israel was a state in smuggling guns. Then we were doing the bullets. What about the guns? Well, I was just going to put in, the story was going to be about the bullet factory. And so, bowing to someone who's telling us what to do, we added in a portion about the smuggling of the guns, and actually found a major smuggler here in Philadelphia. So people sort of led me to this one, led me to that one. And, this story could have even been bigger than it was, but I wanted to make it focused on the fact that these people did something as teenagers extraordinary and changed the course of history. And so the research was one aspect, and also learning from these people's interviews about what they had to say and what really happened.
Absolutely. It's a very, very tightly drawn and taut film. It's very, the pace is very, very quick, and it moves along very, very, very beautifully. So I think you certainly accomplished that goal that you just mentioned. I wanted to ask you, what was it like filming in Israel? What was it like casting there? I mean, using, for the most part, as far as I could see, young Israeli actors who may or may not have ever heard about Kibbutz Hill or about the Ayalon Institute.
Well, it was interesting to me because more Americans knew about the place and go there to visit it than Israelis. And I liken it to the fact that I live now, although I mentioned I lived around the country in different places, but the Liberty Bell, like everybody who comes to Philadelphia is like, let's go to the Liberty Bell. Oh my gosh, we who live here probably I went as a brownie, but I don't go to the Liberty Bell. And so I'm just saying that it's in their backyard in Rehovot. So it might be why either they take it for granted, don't visit it, some know, but a lot of people don't. So it was interesting to me that Americans were the ones who were very excited about this story and really wanted it told. As far as shooting in Israel, it's a challenge. My Hebrew is limited. I certainly can't be telling people what to do in that language. So we hired a fixer. That's what I call him. That's not his real name. And he has worked on a lot of films in Israel. So he was obviously the person that could get us to the actors. Remember, we needed period costumes that were appropriate, the uniforms and things like that. You have to feed the crew and that kind of thing. We also built sets because there were some things that were missing. So we actually had to hire carpenters, construction guys, and we left the sets there. And actually friends of mine went to the bullet factory after that, and they were talking about they kept the set there, and it became part of the experience of going to the bullet factory. And they were telling people who were coming through, yeah, we have this film crew from Philadelphia, my friends, we know them. They're our friends. So everything sort of had to be done from the ground up there. But I got to tell you, they were wonderful. Our fixer, Net Rosenblum, was fantastic. He helped us get everybody, and they were very into it. And then they brought one day young Israelis, so the soldiers in the IDF, because we didn't want the film just to be about what was past. We also wanted to show how it was relevant to today. So those soldiers had never been there, and they were very moved when we were there, and we interviewed some of them about what it meant to them. And I think that was also, and that's in the film, which I'm sure you saw, and I think is very moving as well.
Yeah, there's some very really striking sort of talking heads of young soldiers talking about the impact and how it relates to them today. It's beautifully done. Rodney, let me ask you, Rodney, what was your familiarity with Israel and Israeli history before you started working on this project?
It's interesting. I have a little bit of history, and I've worked on a number of films that had Jewish themes to them, and just through friends and acquaintances had um, you know some experience with Jewish culture, and so I had some idea. I didn't know about this particular kibbutz and found it really fascinating and interesting to learn about. And as a big fan of history, even on my own into preparing for writing the score, I did a little deep dive into the history and went back to the origins of the British occupation and found out, how the British decided that they were not going to allow the Israelis, the soon to be called Israelis, to have bullets, which I found just absolutely fascinating. It just seems kind of an odd thing to put into a treaty. So yeah, it was a big introduction. But yeah, I've worked on a number of other projects, both musical and film based, that were part of the Jewish culture.
That's great. I wanted to ask you as well, Rodney. Did you have the opportunity to visit Israel and to see the site as part of this project?
No, no. As the composer on a project, you're mainly relegated to the studio. I was brought into the project. I think, Laura, if I'm correct, you guys had already started shooting, and I was brought in probably maybe a little more than a third of the way through by the director of the film, Michael Lopate. I've worked on a number of films with him in the past, and he brought me in to originally do the music for the promotional trailer or their fundraising trailer for the film. And that's how I began the journey with Ayalon, and then Laurel and I met, and now we're working on another project together, which is awesome.
Fantastic. Laurel, you mentioned some of the challenges of, because none of it was documented, certainly not by video and often not in photos at the time. I wondered if there were any sort of unique or memorable anecdotes from the filming that you can share with us.
Let's see, there were so many of them, but one of the ones that I think people would find interesting, because it's also in the film, is the woman Yehuda Ayalon. And I said, wait a minute, was that really her name? Well, she was from Germany, and when she came to Israel, she took on that name when she worked at the boat factory. But anyway, she was, I had sent people to pre-interview Shlomo Hillel, who just passed, and who was phenomenal. And then we interviewed him again when we were there. And Yehudit Ayalon, who's the woman in the film. She's very wrinkly. She's very funny. And so in order to raise money, we had to have something to show people. So we hired an Israeli crew, and they shot just the 2 minutes, just a quick thing. Anyway, on the eve of the day that we were leaving, she passed away in her sleep. So thank goodness I had her story. Now she was older, but she was healthy. She went to bed and just never woke up. Well, so when we got there, I had been walking around the property. I went the first time on the mission, like I said. And when I went back to actually shoot it, which was only my second time there, I was walking around with our fixer and, scouting out locations. And I went into the mess hall, and there was a picture of all these children. And all of a sudden my latent reporter instincts awoke. And I said, what children? Who are these children? I mean, the people that were there were teenagers when they were working there. Who are these children? Well, as teenagers, they were 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Well, some of them had children. And so they said, well, these are kids who were born here. I said, well, can we interview any of them? And they said, yes. Well, one of them in the picture was this beautiful little blonde haired child. And it turned out it was Yehudit Ayalon's daughter. So we went to go interview her. And because her mother had just passed, like I mentioned, they were going through her things, and they found her diary from those days. And they said, would you be interested? I said, yes, yes. So the fact is, it was really interesting that the whole thing of not only interviewing her, because I didn't even realize that they had children there, and also the fact of, because she was gone, we had a diary from those days. And what was really fascinating to me is she wrote down almost what she ate every day, but yet was very vague about what exactly they were doing, because they impressed upon them that this was so secret that the other people on the kibbutz didn't even know. So she didn't even put down in the diary exactly what's going on. She alluded to things, but even if that diary had fallen into the wrong hands, you wouldn't have known what they were doing. So I thought that that was, the whole chronology of that, not only finding the daughter, interviewing her, and then hence getting to the diary.
That's remarkable. There's a beautiful sequence in the movie where the daughter pulls out this kind of like a plastic tub where she's stored, looks like dozens and dozens of her mother's diaries, right? And and there's a beautiful shot of the handwriting, and she says her mother was so detailed and wrote everything, just as you said,
Right.
wrote everything down. It's beautiful.
And about how important a time that was to her. That many of these people, when we talked to them, they weren't allowed to wear a uniform. So they were made fun of because everybody was fighting for a cause and they looked like they were not, but they actually were. And it hurt them that they knew they were doing something important for the country and couldn't say it. Only till later on did the heroic part that they played in this come to light. And so, they were forced to keep it quiet, even though they wanted to shout it from the rooftop. We're helping, we're in on it. We want to make a difference too. And they were really remarkable people, and many of them went on to do other things, as you saw by the ending credits. And we only picked out a few of them. Went on to do other things that also were very important for the state of Israel.
Absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, Shlomo Hillel, who just passed about a month ago, and he went on
Yeah.
to be the Speaker of the Knesset and a very long time.
And he did, and other things. I mean, he was a Messiah. Well, I'm sure but he was. That's the only thing I put on that. And he rescued 120,000 Jews. Helped rescue, not just him, from Iraq, but also he was in the Mossad. He was the Minister of Police. He was an ambassador. So, he and many others went on, and then many of them who didn't do outstanding things, but still were, worked for the state of Israel on beyond what happened at the Bull Factory.
Absolutely. Rodney, I was really struck by how beautifully you captured the mood of the film as well. And I wanted to ask you, did you know a lot about Israeli music before you started working on this project?
Yes, I do. Through a number of projects I've worked on in the past, I've worked with Udi Bar David, who's the cellist in the Philadelphia Orchestra, who started an organization called Intercultural Journeys, which brought together actually Arab and Jewish musicians, and I worked with him a lot. I've worked with a singer named Phyllis Chappelle, who is listed as one of the top 500 jazz vocalists of all time, but she also does a lot of interesting versions of traditional Jewish music. And I also, and just from other projects and research I've done, it's just one of those things that kind of is in my wheelhouse. And it's also music I'm fascinated with. I love the microtones that exist in Middle Eastern music, and the rhythms. I just find them fascinating and interesting. They kind of speak to my soul.
That's remarkable. I mean, and the truth is that I found that the music really fits in seamlessly with the action and the narration. So kudos to you for achieving that. It's not always the case with soundtracks of movies, right?
Oh yeah, and thank you for that. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to create something that sounded contemporary, but also sounded ethnic or Middle Eastern, but wasn't what's the word I'm looking for? Wasn't obvious. So I landed on this idea of this combination, and also we didn't have a huge budget for, like, I couldn't bring in a full orchestra or tons of musicians. So I landed on this idea of doing this kind of percolating electronic stuff to create the tension, and then came up with this a couple of themes to play around with on different instruments that sort of would carry the melodic sensibility and a thematic sensibility of the score. And also keeping in mind that it's a documentary, so I'm also there just to keep the story rolling and not to take over musically. There's really not a pace for a big theme to happen. So I'm also keeping in mind that I need to stay under and just create enough emotional or sort of what do I always call it I'm creating the oral environment for the oral sound environment for the film to take place in. So if something's happening on screen, I want to make sure the audience, okay, this is tense. Okay, this is light. Okay, you can laugh here. It's okay. Even though it's a real serious film, it's okay to laugh here. And all those kind of things I'm trying to, give the audience sort of like just enough of a cue to know that it's okay to feel those kinds of emotions.
Well, I think mission accomplished on that score, definitely.
Thank you.
Laurel, I wanted to ask you something.
I'm sorry. It really makes such a difference because when we did the film before we had the music in it and we sort of handed it to Rodney, the difference is night and day as to creating the mood, when you hear that. So he really did a fantastic job. And even in the bridge music, it's not just it's every sound you hear, even if it's because some of the video that we had didn't have sound behind it. Like, I'm just making this up, but the train going down the tracks. Well, you need to hear, and so blending that seamlessly and underneath is also another skill set that Rodney contributed as to making the whole thing have the right backdrop, have the right sound that even you're not even processing, it's just there.
Yeah, one of the things I'm very lucky in as a composer is that I also am the person, in a project that is the size of this that we're talking about. I ended up being the sound designer and also the sound mixer. So I have a lot of not only control, but I'm aware of. Okay, I'm putting like Laurel's saying, I'm putting this train sound here, and that is critical to the scene. But I also want the music to sit in a certain place. So even as I'm composing the music for this scene, I'm also thinking, well, what am I going to do as sound design, and how will the sound design, the dialogue, and the music all fit together? So all of that is kind of in my brain as I'm working on the music, which isn't usually the case when I'm working on a project where I'm just the composer. And I don't actually know a lot of the times, because they're sometimes happening at the same time. The sound designer's working over here, and I'm working over here as the composer. I don't know what they're doing. So when the sound mixer gets it, they're trying to figure out how the two blend together. But in the case of this film, for me, I'm all of them. So I'm thinking of it all at the same time. I'm thinking, oh, when this scene happens here, that noise that when the big reveal of the washing machine moves over, that's going to be a big sound, but it's also got to be a big musical moment. All right, so so I'm thinking about that as I'm composing.
Absolutely, that comes across really beautifully. Laura, let me ask you. So Shlomo Hillel makes a really important point that during the British Mandate pre-1948, all activities related to Jewish statehood were illegal and would be punished. But the activities related to ammunition production were the most dangerous and would be punishable by death. And this is really dramatic shot of a hanging. I wonder if in your research, if you found that threat was a significant deterrent to people from proposing this very dramatic plan for the bullet factory, or for implementing the plan. Where do you think, did it deter a lot of people? And if not, then where do you think they found the courage and the inspiration to move forward in any case?
I don't think it deterred anyone. I just think it made it more organized, in the sense of the Haganah was sort of behind the bullet factory. And so people who, that's what they knew what the consequences were of not doing anything, perhaps banded together. I don't, perhaps one-on-one it deterred someone, but it made people come together and get organized as to how we can do this covertly so that it could be mission accomplished. And I think that they knew that it wasn't an option. It wasn't, they couldn't not do it. So in that case, it's when your back's against the wall, there is no choice. So they started early on this, even before 1947. You heard the whole in the movie that we go over the chronology of buying the machines and smuggling them, and they had to wait till after the war to pick them up. So they had a feeling it was going to come to this, and more people got on board with it as it got closer and closer to become, statehood becoming a reality after the war. but this was already in motion. I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't been allowed to, the UN didn't vote to give them statehood, but people were coalescing around action. And so I don't think that it deterred anyone. I think it motivated, if anything.
The film makes the point as well, Laurel, that after independence in 1948, the members of this group sort of went on with their lives, and most of them never talked about the experiences. They just kept to themselves. And so this very critical chapter in Israel's history went unknown for many decades. I wonder why you think they really kept it quiet after 1948.
Well, I actually asked that. That was one of my first questions was, why did you, even after you didn't need to, okay, we understand why there was secrecy at the time, but now that it's in the past. And they said, well, they told us not. The best answer I ever got, which isn't complete in my mind, but was we were told not to talk about it. And so we just didn't. And actually, we didn't think we did anything that special. We did what had to be done, and that was it, which is so different from people of today who boast about anything they do, and if anything, exaggerated. In this case, they minimized it. So they felt like they just played their part. So why we didn't do anything that was that special? Why talk about it? But I do have to say that they were glad when we interviewed them that even though it was decades later, that what they did was being recognized and they kind of, when they thought about it more, a couple times they said, yeah, what we did was special. We didn't really think about it before this, but now we realize it was a time in history and we stepped up. They didn't use those words, but that seemed to be the thought process now. But I don't know if we wouldn't have come along, this story would have just passed, into folklore that people did it. But these are actually the people, some of them who worked on the, underground in the bull factory, and some who were just on the kibbutz, the giraffes, who didn't know what was going on. But we wanted to give the whole picture of those times.
I think it's remarkable. And I think, as you said, that they came together to do what needed to be done. If it needs to be, you just got to do it, right? I had a couple of questions about things that weren't 100% clear to me. And I think that maybe some of the other members of the audience might have the same questions. So maybe you can help clarify them for us. One thing that wasn't clear was about the members of the group. There's this very memorable scene where the Palmach commander, Amos Horeb, comes to this group of very young, idealistic people, and he says, we have this idea. I won't tell you what it is, but I need all of your agreement. It has to be unanimous. And it says that all 45 of them had to agree, and only then would he tell them the precise details. He goes for a walk. There's a great scene where he goes for a walk. They come back, and the 45 of them agree. So the film also says that not everybody at the Institute knew what was going on. There were 120 people or so at the Institute. So who were the 45 and who were the rest of the 120?
Well, the 45 were the people who actually worked in the bullet factory underground, and the rest of them were just people who were on the kibbutz. They were the giraffes, and they called them that. There's a scene how they came upon that name, that they could see across, but they couldn't see down, because giraffe has those long necks. And so not everybody was in on the secret. So there was 120 some people in total on the kibbutz. Only 45 of those 120 or 125 or whatever it was, but of the total were in on the secret, which, it was funny because my director, we made the point a couple times in the film, and he said, look, people already know that. I said, but we got to keep telling them, because it is a little tricky, because you figure everyone on the kibbutz was in on it, but no, only certain people. And they told the others that they were going to work on the citrus groves, and that's why they had to have a sun lamp, because if you were out working on the citrus groves instead of underground all day, you would be pale white. Someone would say, how was that possible? We were outside, it was 90 degrees out. So they had one of the first sun lamps that were imported from the United States, and they got special, food, milk, and things like that, because they were underground. So of all the people that were there, and it was a way station, the kibbutz was actually people came to that kibbutz and then went other places. So that was another reason that place was chosen, amongst other reasons, was because people coming and going, you don't always know who's there. So the fact that 45 people disappeared every day, as one of the guys said, they were there and then we didn't know where they just disappeared. They did come up for lunch, for meals, but during the day when they were allegedly in the citrus groves, they were underground. And really only one person, which we didn't get into in the film, ever found out about the secret. And that one person, the laundry facility got so popular with the British that they had to bring another person in because they were making money at this. It was only supposed to be a ruse. It wasn't really supposed to be. They just wanted to keep the washing machines going to cover the noise. But the British heard about it, started bringing their uniforms. They had to open a second facility, a place in town, because they didn't want them coming up to pick the laundry up. And so they had to bring an extra helping hand, if you will. And she was working in the laundry facility, obviously up top, for almost a year. And one day she came back and all of a sudden she saw the washing machine move across and she saw these people coming up Sphinx-like from below, and she screamed, and they had to tell her what happened. And it turned out that one of the women below was pregnant. So she actually switched, and the pregnant woman became the helper upstairs, and she went down, but she wasn't alive anymore. And so I had to cut certain things. And so I thought the fact that one person actually found out, we did make the point in the film about the partisans from Europe. They had been in the war and they, fought in the forest. So they were part of the resistance. So they obviously were women who were used to having their antenna up. And they asked them, do you notice anything funny on this kibbutz? And they said, there's something of secrecy going on, but we don't know what it is. So they never, who would be attuned to things like that, never found out. And that was the closest that anyone ever came, that something was odd. So the answer is that only a portion of the people on the kibbutz even knew about it, let alone anyone outside of the kibbutz.
That's an incredible story. I have one more question about the giraffes, something that wasn't so clear to me, and thank you for that clarification. So if there were, 75 or so other people on the kibbutz who were the giraffes who didn't know what was going on underground, how did they accept the fact that no visitors were allowed? There's that beautiful scene, very heartbreaking scene where the father comes and the daughter turns him away and says, please don't come back. How did the giraffes, who weren't allowed to know about the secret, how did they accept this no visitors policy?
Well, they made all these excuses up. They had hoof and mouth disease. They said they had every sickness known to man. So they had the doctor say, you can't have visitors here because we have this here. And then there was always some other excuse of why. But you saw that if someone did come in, and it was very rare, they really tried to keep them out. They walked with them. They didn't let them out of their sight, so that they couldn't accidentally stumble upon something. Because, really, you didn't know who you could trust. Maybe somebody would turn on them and tell the British or tell the Arabs, or who knows. So they really tried to discourage, whether it was British soldiers, who some of them were their friends. They had fought with them in the war, some of the men. And, you saw that whole story about the beer, how they tried to give us 24 hours notice, and when we share a beer together, we'll put it on ice. So then they had notice and they shut everything down. Or they had every disease known to man, so you don't want to come in here because you might catch it. To if someone actually braved all those elements and they actually made it inside, they knew they were coming in and they walked them around. They didn't even let them off the path. So that's sort of how they handled not only discouraging, but watching any visitor.
Makes a lot of sense. Another question I had was, the workers, you did a great job displaying or demonstrating the enormous dangers that the workers in the underground plant were exposed to: the heat, sudden explosions, certainly discovery by the British, which carried the potential death penalty. Do you think that they really and truly realized the extent of the dangers, and that their ideology just gave them the courage to carry out the mission? Or they just kind of dumb, naive kids at the time? What do you think?
No, they knew, because it was more likely that they were going to blow themselves up than they were going to actually make any bullets that worked. So that was probably the strongest danger or the most prevalent of the, but yes, they knew very well. That's why they kept the secret, was if anyone found out, they would have been hanged. But even more imperative is in just their day to day of making their bullets, they're supposed to explode. And if it wasn't calibrated right, that, there's something could happen. So yes, they were very aware of the dangers. And I think, as Israelis do, they probably put it in a compartment in their brain and just carried on. So I don't think it's that they were naive and didn't realize it and got into it. I think they were very aware and did it anyway, which is all the more admirable.
Absolutely. So I have two final questions, one for Rodney and one for Laurel, if I may. Rodney, I wanted to ask you about that beautiful and haunting song, Mi Ha'ish, which you used for the closing sequence. From the words are from the book of Psalms, and a very, very well-known melody, and of course the words to many Jewish people. I wondered how you chose it.
Well, it's funny. So as I was working on the film, I one day called Laura. I said, "Laura, I have the perfect song for the closing credits." And she goes, "What's that?" I go, "Here, I'm going to send it to you." And she says, "Oh, yeah, this is great. This is perfect." So the story is, a few years ago, I was producing an album for Phyllis Chappelle called Naked World. And actually, prior to that, the reason we started making the album was we had done, Phyllis came to me and said, "I have this song I sing all the time, and I really would like to do something interesting with it." And it was Mi Haish. And so we started working on it. And the first thing was I looked at the translation of the words and the psalm. And it was interesting to find varying translations of it, which was, it was very curious to me, like how many different versions there were that I found that slightly changed the meaning of it. But basically, you know the translation, it's, he basically, don't speak evil, don't say bad things about people, don't hang out with bad people, and you'll be good in your life. And there was something about that struck me as being connected to the film in some way. And so so Phyllis and I set out on recording that track, and it was in the library. So when I was working on the film, I really thought, oh, this is the perfect song for the closing credits. And so that's how it became a part of the film.
And I understand that we might be fortunate enough to hear a small segment from that right now.
Yeah, I can play a little bit of Phyllis singing and the recording of the song. Here it goes. And that cello that you were just about to hear, obviously, as I said before, it's Udi Bar David from the Philadelphia Orchestra playing cello. And also, it's, no, I'm blanking on the other musicians. One of them is me, and an amazing percussionist, Joey Tayoun.
It's a beautiful, beautiful, completely appropriate choice for the closing credits, in my opinion. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
The very last question, Laurel, if I may, you talked a lot about finding archival footage and as well as shooting new footage. I wondered, how did you decide on the mix? What was the right combination of what was authentic footage from the time and what was recreated? It's beautiful.
Well, we had to do a lot of the historical stuff because some of us know it, but a lot of people don't, especially younger people. So what they did was important in the context of what had happened before and what was happening, a few years. So, way before, setting the tone from the turn of the century, and immediately before. So all those things had to be historic. I couldn't recreate that. That needed to be archival material. And there were things that would work. As far as the things on the bullet factory itself, there was nothing. So we actually did that's why we did the recreations. That's why there's some animation in there to try to, jazz it up. I mean, we really had a bridge. Most of the time, there's a lot of video for a story. Matter of fact, there's an excess. And you can cherry pick. Hey, this would be great. No, this is better. No, let's use this. In this case, the trick with this is, how do we bring this to life? It's a great story. We have the people. How do we weave in the pictures so that people can see what happened? And so what I could get archivally, we did. And we hired an archival librarian because she had to look through all the stuff in Israel. She's an Israeli, and she actually works on Nancy Spielberg's films because Nancy's a friend and she connected us. And anything else that we could recreate at the Bullet Factory, most of it we did. And like I said, we also created a set. We had a set built because when they were putting the bullets into what they called the dwarf, where they smuggled them to the freedom fighters on the front lines, we had a still. That's all we had. So how long is that going to last? So we actually built a recreation of it and had them, bringing the bolts and putting it in. And that's one of the sets that we left there. So honestly, we pulled out every trick in the book to try to make the video come alive and be interesting. There wasn't a lot there. So that was, and hopefully it's seamless, like you alluded to, which makes me very happy. And that people are not only hearing what these first person accounts, but also feeling like they're there a little bit, from the recreations.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, just to sum up, I think not only have you sort of brought this very, very important and relatively unknown story to the eyes of the world, but you've also made an impact at the site of the museum by leaving the set behind and having that now being incorporated into the visit that many, many visitors can enjoy for years to come. So that's just wonderful. I'd like to thank once again Laurel Fairworth, the producer, and Rodney Whittenberg, the musician, composer, and sound designer from the movie Codename Ayalon, for joining us. Thank you to all of our members, our sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, SAGE, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all these years. And thank you to our audience for participating in the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival.